Welcome to Chinese History and Mythology.
Hey friends, welcome back to Chinese History and Mythology. Starting from episode 101, we entered one of the most famous dynasties in history, the Qin dynasty. Although the Qin dynasty existed for only 15 years in Chinese history, it made an enormous contribution to the history of China as a whole. Even today, Qin Shi Huang still attracts scholars around the world who are interested in studying his historical background. And once we start talking about the Qin dynasty, there's one place that we absolutely have to mention, and that is the Terracotta Army. Now let us turn our eyes to Shanxi province in western China today, to the east of what was once the ancient city of Xi'an. A few decades ago, that land was still just ordinary farmland. The farmers there had worked the fields for generations and lived from the yellow earth beneath their feet. Let us go back to the year 1974. It was a dry year, and water had become extremely precious. Several villagers from Xiang village decided to dig a well near the village in search of water. They raised their hose and dug into the ground. At first, they expected to hit damp soil or stone, but when they dug deeper, their tools struck hard fragments of clay. At first, they thought these were only ordinary roof tiles or broken pieces of ancient pottery. On this old land of China, finding ancient ceramic fragments in the soil was not really unusual, but as they kept digging, the situation began to change. They uncovered what looked like human bodies, with arms, with legs, and even with clear facial features. These were not ordinary figurines. They were almost the same size as real people. The villagers were shocked, and some of them were even frightened, because in traditional thinking, digging up objects that looked like human beings was often connected with something mysterious. News of the discovery quickly reached the local cultural authorities, and archaeological experts soon arrived at the site. After an initial investigation, the experts realized that this was not an ordinary group of burial objects at all, but a massive underground military formation. This was how the discovery of the Qin Shi Huang Terracotta Army pits, which later shocked the world, first began. This discovery was not just an archaeological news story.
It was like a key that opened a door for modern people, leading back to that powerful empire from more than 2,000 years ago. For foreign friends, it may be hard to understand why an ancient emperor would bury thousands of clay soldiers underground. This involves one of the most important ideas in ancient Chinese culture, the view of life and death, and the culture of ancestor worship. In traditional Chinese understanding, death was not the end, it was the beginning of another form of existence. Ancient people believed that after death, the soul would enter another world, a world often called the underworld, and if the soul was going to continue living there, then it was best if the things a person had in life could also go with them after death. This idea was expressed in a very extreme way in the early history of China. During the Shang dynasty and the early Zhou dynasty, when nobles died, human sacrifice often took place. In other words, living slaves, guards, and even wives or concubines could be killed and buried beside the tomb of the master so that they could continue serving him in the next world. From today's point of view, this was extremely cruel and inhuman, but within the social structure of that time, it was seen as a sign of rank and also as a symbol of the master's power and status. However, as civilization gradually developed, especially by the Spring and Autumn period and the Warring States period, this practice of burying real people as grave goods began to face doubt and opposition. Confucian thought started to rise, emphasizing benevolence and a more human-centered view. Although it did not completely eliminate human sacrifice, mainstream society began to look for another solution. Qin Shi Huang, the Jing we mentioned earlier, and the Qin dynasty he founded, stood right at this key turning point in history. Besides creating a highly effective political system, building roads, and constructing the Great Wall, Jing, as Emperor of Qin, held supreme power. He wanted to continue having thousands of soldiers and horses after death, and he wanted to keep ruling his empire even in the next world. But he could not, or perhaps no longer needed to, use large numbers of living people as burial sacrifices. The appearance of pottery figures solved this problem exactly. Human forms were made from clay, fired in kilns, painted in color, dressed in armor, and placed with weapons in their hands. In symbolic meaning, they were equal to real people, but in physical reality, no human lives had to be sacrificed. This was a step forward in civilization, and also a leap in craftsmanship and technology. The discovery of the Terracotta Army pits allows us to see the most extreme form of this substitute. These are not simply a pile of clay figures, they are a complete underground army. At present, 3 main pits of the Terracotta Army are known, and they are numbered Pit 1, Pit 2, and Pit 3. Among them, Pit 1 is the largest in scale. It is a rectangular pit filled with tightly arranged infantry formations. Just imagine standing on the viewing platform at the edge of the pit and looking down. The visual impact is enormous. Thousands of terracotta figures stand in perfect order, all facing east. Why are they facing east? This is connected to the geographical position of the Qin state. Qin originated in the western part of China, in the region of present-day Gansu and Shanxi. To its east were the other 6 feudal states. Qin Shi Huang's wars of unification were mainly fought from west to east, so this underground army faces east, symbolizing that they were always ready to protect the emperor and defend against enemies from the east, or perhaps symbolizing that even after death, the emperor still intended to inspect his lands to the east. The Terracotta Army was discovered on March 29, 1974, in Lintong District, Xi'an, Shanxi Province, China. And interestingly enough, it was really a pure accident. In the spring of that year, the Lintong area was suffering from a severe drought. Several farmers from Xiang village were digging a well for water about 1.5 kilometers east of the mausoleum of Qin Shi Huang. But as they kept digging, what came up was not muddy water. Instead, they found broken pieces of life-sized clay figures and ancient bronze arrowheads. At first, people thought they had simply uncovered the remains of some old kiln site from another period. But after the news spread, it quickly caught the attention of archaeologists, and once the excavation began, that great Qin army, which had been lying underground for more than 2,000 years, started to emerge. So where exactly is the Terracotta Army today? Its specific location is in Lintong District, Xi'an, Shanxi Province, about 1.5 kilometers directly east of the burial mound of Qin Shi Huang's mausoleum. Today, a very impressive museum has been built there, the Museum of the Terracotta Warriors and Horses of Qin Shi Huang. If you ever have the chance to visit Xi'an, just head toward Lintong District. Once you find that huge arched building, you have arrived at the Terracotta Army site. If you go closer and observe carefully, the most astonishing thing about the Terracotta Army is the individuality of each figure. Even though they were produced in large numbers, if you look closely at each face, you will see that no two are exactly the same. Some faces look young, while others look old. Some have beards, while others are clean-shaven. Some look stern, while others seem to carry the faintest hint of a smile. Archaeologists and historians believe that these clay figures may have been modeled on real Qin soldiers. When the craftsmen made them, they may have used molds for the basic parts of the body, such as the legs and torso, but the details of the head, especially the facial features, were likely carved by hand. This method gave each terracotta figure its own unique sense of life. In the ancient world, more than 2,000 years ago, this kind of terracotta figure was extremely rare. In other civilizations of the same period, large sculptures often aimed for divine perfection and uniformity, while the craftsmen of Qin were trying to capture the real appearance of human beings. Beyond the facial expressions, the clothing and hairstyles of the terracotta warriors also provide a huge amount of historical information. The Qin dynasty valued the color black, and this is recorded in historical texts because according to the Chinese theory of the 5 elements, Qin believed it belonged to the virtue of water, and the color associated with water was black. On the terracotta warriors, we can still see that although much of the original color has fallen away after more than 2,000 years of oxidation, when they were first unearthed, they were actually brightly painted. Besides black armor and robes, there were also red, green, blue, and other colors. The craftsmen used natural mineral pigments such as cinnabar, azurite, and malachite. These colors were not only for beauty, they were also used to distinguish rank and military type. Hairstyles were also an important marker of identity. The way Qin soldiers arranged their hair buns was very complex. Some were tied toward the left, some toward the right, and some were gathered on top of the head. In actual combat, this could help protect the head. Together with head cloths and armor, it could reduce injury from enemy weapons. By studying these hair buns and headdresses, we can tell which figures were ordinary soldiers, which were military officers, and which were high-ranking generals. The armor of high-ranking generals was made with greater care, the armor plates were smaller, the connections were tighter, and there were often decorative knots on the chest and back to show their status. This strict hierarchy was perfectly reproduced in the terracotta figures, reflecting the strict discipline and organized structure inside the Qin army.
The making of the Terracotta Army was itself a massive system project. It is estimated that, with the level of technology available in the Qin dynasty, completing these clay figures would have required thousands upon thousands of craftsmen working for decades. These craftsmen came from all across the empire. Some were official artisans working for the state, while others were laborers drafted into service. On the bottoms of some figures, or in hidden places, archaeologists have found inscriptions. These usually record the names of the craftsmen or the government workshop to which they belonged. If a terracotta figure cracked during firing or was damaged during transport, the managers could use these names to trace responsibility and carry out punishment. This strict management system ensured the quality of the finished work. In earlier parts of our discussion, we mentioned that the laws of the Qin dynasty were famous for being severe, and that same severity also appeared in handicraft production. Every stage had someone responsible for it, and every step was recorded. This highly organized ability to mobilize society was one of the key reasons Qin Shi Huang was able to complete giant projects such as the Great Wall, the Lingkou Canal, the Straight Roads, and the Imperial Mausoleum. The Terracotta Army is only one part of the mausoleum of Qin Shi Huang. It is located on the eastern side of the mausoleum. The scale of the entire mausoleum is far greater than the known Terracotta Army pits. According to historical records and modern remote sensing surveys, the underground palace was filled with mercury to imitate rivers, lakes, and seas, while its ceiling was decorated with jewels to represent the sun, moon, and stars. The Terracotta Army, as the outer guarding force, protected the emperor at the center of the underground palace. This layout reflects the ancient Chinese view of the universe. Even after death, the emperor remained the center of the cosmos, and everything around him continued to serve him. Now let us talk about the weapons. A large number of real combat weapons were unearthed from the Terracotta Army pits. Most of them were made of bronze. By the late Warring States period, although iron had already begun to be used, bronze weapons still held the dominant position because bronze casting technology had already reached its peak at that time. The bronze swords of the Qin army were very long, some even exceeding 90 centimeters. In hand-to-hand combat at that time, the length of a sword meant an advantage in attack range. Even more surprising is that when these bronze swords were unearthed, they were still sharp, and their surfaces had a layer of anti-rust oxidation treatment. There was once a claim that this was the result of chromium salt oxidation treatment, a technology supposedly connected with modern science, but later research has tended to believe that it was the result of natural lacquer and soil conditions working together, or that the craftsmen had mastered special alloy formulas and polishing methods during casting. Whatever the technical details may have been, the excellent preservation of these weapons itself proves the high level of Qin handicraft production. Besides swords, there were also crossbows. The crossbow was a long-range weapon of that time, similar to a bow and arrow, but equipped with a mechanical trigger, allowing delayed release, greater accuracy, and stronger penetrating power. The crossbow parts unearthed from the Terracotta Army pits are extremely precise, and the gears and trigger components could be exchanged between weapons. This shows that the Qin dynasty had already achieved standardized weapon production. Just imagine it. More than 2,000 years ago, the Qin military workshops were already capable of making interchangeable parts. That is a miracle even in the history of world warfare. This standardization meant that if a crossbow broke on the battlefield, a soldier could quickly replace the damaged part without having to wait for a special craftsman to repair it. This was one of the material foundations that allowed the Qin army to maintain such strong fighting power, and once we start talking about weapons, we have to mention one of the most legendary master craftsmen in Chinese history, Liu Ban. Let us turn the clock back for a moment to the Spring and Autumn period and the Warring States period, roughly from 507 BC to 444 BC. Liu Ban did not actually have the family name Liu. His surname was Ji, his clan name was Gongshu, and his personal name was Ban. The Ji surname was the royal surname of the Zhou dynasty, and the noble families of the state of Lu also carried the Ji surname.
So historical records say that he was from the ducal clan of Lu, meaning that he belonged to the ruling family of the state of Lu. Lu Ban is most famous as the founding master of carpentry. The carpenter's square, the ink marker, the plane, the drill, and the saw are all said to have been invented by him. As for exactly where in Lu he came from, the opinions have never fully agreed. Some say he was from Kufu in Shandong, some say Tengzhou in Shandong, and some say Lushan in Henan. Lu Ban was born into a family of craftsmen. From childhood, he worked alongside his family, touching every kind of work, including carpentry, stonework, and construction. In today's words, he was a child who grew up on building sites. Later, he went to the state of Chu and helped Chu make weapons. The most famous of these was the Cloud Ladder, a siege machine used in attacking city walls, which could be set against a wall so that soldiers could climb up it. If you have ever seen films or television dramas about ancient warfare, that tall ladder leaning against a city wall is exactly what the ancient Cloud Ladder looked like. This invention is clearly recorded in the chapter Gong Shu in the Mozi. There was also something called the Gao Qiang, a tool used in naval warfare. Lu Ban invented a kind of hook that could catch an enemy ship when it tried to retreat, so it could not escape, and could push it away when it tried to come closer, so it could not approach. At that time, the states of Chu and Yu fought on the Yangtze River. It was easy for Chu's ships to move downstream, but hard for them to return upstream. The ships of Yu faced the exact opposite situation. Chu used this tool, and as a result, it defeated Yu. Then there was the wooden magpie, and this one sounds almost like science fiction. In the chapter Lu Wen of the Mozi, it says that Lu Ban made a magpie from bamboo and wood, and after it flew into the sky, it did not fall for 3 days. Based on this, some people say he was humanity's earliest inventor of a flying machine.
So then, what connection could there possibly be between this master ancestor of carpenters and the Terracotta Army of the Qin dynasty more than 200 years later? That is a very interesting question. One is the legendary founding master of craftsmen, and the other is the underground military formation of Qin Shi Huang. And surprisingly, there really is a connection between them. Lu Ban himself definitely did not take part in making the Terracotta Army. Lu Ban lived from the late spring and autumn period into the early Warring States period, around 500 BC. The Terracotta Army, on the other hand, was made and buried underground more than 200 years later, after Qin Shi Huang had unified the 6 states. There was a gap of about 200 years between them, so Lu Ban could not possibly have lived that long. But the technology, tools, and craft traditions represented by Lu Ban's era were exactly the foundation that made the Terracotta Army possible. The Terracotta Army was the result of several hundred years of accumulated technical development, and Lu Ban was one of the symbolic figures in that long process of accumulation. Without the woodworking tools of masters like Lu Ban, there would have been no Terracotta Army. The Terracotta Army was made from fired clay, but if you think it was simply a matter of shaping clay figures by hand, then that would be far too simple a view. The making of the Terracotta Army relied heavily on wooden tools and molds, and these woodworking techniques were exactly the kind of skills established by the generation of craftsmen represented by Lu Ban. Archaeologists have discovered a large number of traces of wooden remains in the Terracotta Army pits, including the shafts, wheels, and axles of war chariots, the arms of crossbows, the wooden handles of weapons, and the huge beams laid above the pits to bear weight. These wooden objects have long since rotted away, but they left very clear marks in the soil. By filling those traces with plaster, researchers have been able to restore their original shapes. Every one of these wooden parts required very precise carpentry. The wheels of the chariots had to be round, the spokes had to be even, and the axles had to be straight. The arms of the crossbows had to withstand the huge tension of the bowstring, and the grooves had to be cut in exactly the right place. So what made that possible?
It was tools like the carpenter's square, the ink marker, the saw, the plane, and the chisel. The wooden architecture of Lu Ban's era and the assembly of the Terracotta Army. Lu Ban was a carpenter. What he was best at was building houses, making carts, and crafting furniture. One remarkable feature of ancient Chinese wooden architecture was modular construction. A whole building could be broken down into separate pillars, beams, and roof frames. The parts would be made in quantity first, and then everything would be assembled, almost like building blocks. This way of thinking was already very mature during the spring and autumn and Warring States periods when Lu Ban lived. The making of the Terracotta Army used the same way of thinking. If you look carefully at the terracotta warriors, you will notice that they were not shaped as a single figure from head to toe. Instead, they were made in separate parts and then assembled at the end. The head, torso, arms, hands, and legs were all formed separately, either with molds or by hand, then joined together, and finally the seams were smoothed over with fine clay. The positions of the hands and head could be adjusted individually, which gave each figure some small differences. Archaeologists saw this very clearly during restoration. The bodies of the figures are hollow. The torso is like a large jar. First, the lower part was made, then coils of clay were built upward layer by layer, and then the walls were beaten firm with paddles. The arms were made separately and inserted into holes in the torso with tenon-like joints. The hands were shaped separately and attached to the arms. The head was also made separately and then fitted on. Every part was standardized, but some variation could still be introduced during assembly, so although more than 1,000 infantry figures look broadly similar, each still has its own face. This way of thinking, first making the parts and then assembling them, is part of the same tradition as ancient Chinese wooden architecture. Liu Ban was exactly a master of that kind of work, and by the Qin dynasty, that same craft logic had been applied by artisans to the making of terracotta figures. You may ask, if Liu Ban was a carpenter, then why did they not make the figures from wood? Why did they have to fire them in clay?
In fact, wooden figures appeared earlier in China. Wooden burial figures were often found in Shang and Zhou tombs, and by the spring and autumn and warring states periods, they had become even more common. For example, in Chu tombs excavated in Hubei and Honan, groups of wooden figures are often found, and some of them even wore silk clothing. In Liu Ban's time, the burial figures used in tombs were basically all made of wood, but Qin Shi Huang was different. What he wanted was to last for 10,000 generations. Wood buried underground would rot sooner or later, so he chose clay. Once clay is fired hard, it is much stronger than wood. As long as it is not smashed, it can survive for thousands of years. In the Terracotta Army pits, besides the clay figures and bronze chariots, a large number of traces of wooden objects have also been found. The war chariots were wooden, the crossbows were wooden, the bow arms were wooden, the weapon handles were wooden, and even the roof over the pits was supported by wooden beams. There is one especially interesting example. In Pit 2, a war chariot was found in relatively good condition. This chariot was made of wood. Its wheels had a diameter of about 1.4 meters, with 30 spokes, and the axle was about 2.5 meters long. Archaeologists found that the mortise and tenon structure of this chariot was extremely precise. The tenons and the sockets fit together perfectly without using a single nail. Mortise and tenon construction was exactly one of the highest achievements of woodworking in the age of Liu Ban. For modern visitors, seeing the Terracotta Army is like stepping across time. When you stand inside the exhibition hall of Pit 1, you can feel that solemn atmosphere. Even though these clay figures have lost their original colors, and even though some of them are damaged, they still remain standing. They silently face forward, as if waiting for an order that will never come. The power of that silence is more overwhelming than any written description. UNESCO listed the Terracotta Army as a World Cultural Heritage Site, not only because of its artistic value, but also because it bears witness to an age. It shows how human beings organized large-scale production, how they expressed their reverence for death, and how they built a vast empire. For foreign friends, understanding the Terracotta Army is one way to begin understanding Chinese history. It shows the continuity of ancient Chinese civilization. Now that we have finished talking about the silent underground army, the Terracotta warriors, let us turn our eyes back to that turbulent age and look at one famous event that happened before the Qin dynasty was established. This event was not as huge in scale as the Terracotta Army, but it was full of drama, courage, and human struggle. This is the story of Jing Qi's attempt to assassinate the king of Qin. To understand this story, we first need to go back to the political situation at the end of the Warring States period. At that time, Qin had already become extremely powerful, like a huge war machine that kept pushing eastward. The other 6 states were terrified. They had tried to unite against Qin, and in the politics of that time, this was called the Vertical Alliance. But because every state had its own interests and calculations, the alliance was always fragile.
Qin, meanwhile, used the strategy of horizontal alliances to divide the 6 states and defeat them one by one. Against this background, the state of Yan was a country in the northeast of China, and at that time its strength was relatively weak. It was at this moment that Crown Prince Dan of Yan stepped forward. Prince Dan had once been a hostage in the state of Zhao, and later he was also sent as a hostage to Qin. During his time in Qin, he was treated coldly, and it could even be said that he was humiliated.
The king of Qin, Ying, who later became Qin Shi Huang, was still only the king of Qin at that time, and his attitude toward Prince Dan was extremely arrogant. This experience planted the seed of hatred in Prince Dan's heart. After he escaped back to Yan, he kept thinking about how to take revenge on Qin and how to save Yan from its approaching destruction. In the social and political situation of that time, there was almost no chance that Yan could directly send an army and fight Qin in open war. The difference in military strength was too great, and the gap in national power was far too wide. Prince Dan needed an unusual plan. He thought of assassination. There is an old saying that if you want to catch the bandit, you first catch the chief. If the king of Qin could be killed, Qin might fall into internal chaos, and then the other feudal states might have a chance to unite and regain some space to survive. This plan was extremely risky, but in such a desperate situation, it seemed to be the only hope left. So Prince Dan began searching for the right assassin. He needed someone who not only had martial skill, but also courage and reputation. In order to get close to the king of Qin, the assassin had to enter the Qin palace through normal diplomatic channels, so he needed a legitimate identity. It was at this point that a man named Jing entered his view. Jing was not from Yan. He was originally from the state of Wei, and later traveled to Yan. He enjoyed reading and swordsmanship, and he made friends with many heroes from different places. In Yan, he lived quietly among ordinary people in the marketplace, making friends with butchers and musicians, and appearing to be just an ordinary man. But those who knew him understood that he had an extraordinary presence. Prince Dan heard of Jing Qi's reputation and personally went to visit him. He treated Jing Qi with great respect, gave him the best place to live, the best food, and even drove the carriage for him himself. This kind of treatment made Jing Qi feel deeply that he had been truly appreciated. In traditional Chinese culture, there was a special social group called Shai. Shai were neither nobles nor ordinary commoners. They were people with knowledge and skills, and they used their talents to serve those in power. Shi placed great importance on reputation and promise. Once they agreed to someone's request, they would give everything to fulfill it, even at the cost of their own lives. Jing was exactly such a Shi. He accepted Prince Dan's request and decided to carry out this task, even though it was almost impossible. The preparations for the assassination were full of twists and difficulty. Jing knew that if he wanted to see the king of Qin, he had to bring something the king truly wanted as a gift. At that time, Qin was attacking the other states with all its strength, and there were 2 things the king of Qin wanted most. One was the head of a traitor general, and the other was the map of a rich and valuable piece of land. In Yan, there was a general named Fan Wuqi. He had originally been a general of Qin, but after offending the king of Qin, he fled to Yan. The king of Qin offered a huge reward for his head. Jing secretly went to see Fan Wuqi and told him his plan. Jing said that if he could borrow his head, he would be able to get close to the king of Qin, take revenge for him, and also help Yan out of danger. After hearing the plan, Fan Wuqi did not hesitate for a moment. He drew his sword and cut his own throat, offering up his head. The death of Fan Wuqi gave Jing the first crucial token for the assassination plan. The second token was the map of Dukang. Dukang was the richest region of Yan. Offering that land to Qin would show that Yan was willing to submit. The map was placed inside a case, and the sharpest dagger was hidden inside the final roll of the scroll. This dagger had been specially prepared and coated with poison. As long as it broke even a little of the king of Qin's skin, the poison would seal his throat with blood, and he would certainly die. For this dagger, Crown Prince Dan spent 100 pieces of gold searching for craftsmen, soaked it in poison again and again, and even tested it on living people to make sure it was truly deadly. Once everything was ready, Jing was about to leave. This was a tragic and solemn moment. Crown Prince Dan and the guests who knew the truth all wore white clothes and white caps, which were the mourning clothes of that time. They knew that once Jing left, he would most likely never return. They came to the banks of the Ye River to see him off. The Ye River is in what is now Hebei province. This scene later became one of the classic images in Chinese culture,
representing the spirit of sacrifice for one's ideals and one's country, choosing to act even when one knows it cannot succeed. For foreign friends, this may be hard to understand. Why go when you know you will probably die? This touches on the Chinese cultural idea of yi, or righteousness. Yi is a moral principle that rises above personal life and death. When one's own life comes into conflict with the fate of the state and the trust of a friend, choosing the latter is seen as noble. Jing Kei's decision was exactly an expression of this value. Jing Kei arrived in Xianyang, the capital of Qin. Through Meng Jia, a favored minister of the king of Qin, he successfully obtained the chance to enter the palace and meet the king. The palace of Qin was magnificent and heavily guarded. According to the laws of Qin, ministers could not carry weapons when entering the hall, and even the guards could only stand below the hall and were not allowed to come up without an order. This was meant to prevent assassination and protect the safety of the king of Qin. Jing Kei carried the box containing the head of Fan Wuqi, while his assistant Qin Shi Huang carried the case containing the map. Step by step, they climbed the palace steps. Qin Shi Huang, although known as a brave warrior of Yan, became afraid when he faced the majesty of the Qin palace and the many guards. His face turned pale, and his body began to tremble. This aroused the suspicion of the Qin ministers. Jing Kei remained completely calm. He turned and looked at Qin Shi Huang, then smiled and said to the king of Qin that Qin Shi Huang was a man from the rough northern lands and had never seen such a grand scene before, so he hoped the king would not blame him. Jing Kei's calm manner removed the king's suspicion. The king of Qin then ordered that only Jing Kei be allowed into the hall, while Qin Shi Huang had to remain below and wait. This actually made the task harder for Jing Kei, because he now had to carry out the assassination alone, with no helper. Jing Kei stepped into the hall and first presented the head of Fan Wuqi. The king of Qin opened the box, checked it, and was very pleased. Then Jing Kei presented the map. He opened it and slowly showed it to the king. Bit by bit, the map was unrolled, and when it reached the very end, the dagger hidden inside was revealed. At that critical instant, Jing Kei seized the sleeve of the king of Qin with his left hand and took up the dagger with his right, thrusting it toward him. The king of Qin was shocked. He jumped to his feet and tried to draw his sword to fight back. But the sword of Qin was very long, and in the confusion it was hard to pull it free. Jing Kei chased after the king, and the king ran around the pillars inside the hall to avoid him. The guards below the hall had weapons, but without an order they did not dare come up. The ministers had no weapons at all and could only panic helplessly. Someone shouted that the king should push the sword behind his back before drawing it. The king of Qin did so, and finally managed to pull out the long sword. He cut off Jing Kei's left leg. Jing Kei fell to the ground, but still used all his strength to throw the dagger at the king of Qin. He missed, and the dagger struck a bronze pillar instead. Jing Kei knew he had failed. Leaning against the pillar, he laughed loudly and cursed the king of Qin. He said that the reason the plan had not succeeded was because he had wanted to capture him alive and force him to sign an agreement to return land to the feudal lords in order to repay Crown Prince Dan. In the end, the guards rushed forward and killed Jing Kei. This thrilling assassination attempt ended in failure. From a tactical point of view, it was a failed operation. It did not change the course of Qin's unification of the 6 states. Instead, it actually hastened the destruction of Yan. The king of Qin was enraged, and he sent even more troops to attack Yan. Not long after that, the capital of Yan was captured, Crown Prince Dan was killed, and Yan was destroyed. The story of Jing Kei assassinating the king of Qin is extremely famous among Chinese people. The level of familiarity people have with this story is no less than their familiarity with the stories of Journey to the West. So why has the story of Jing Kei's attempt to kill the king of Qin been passed down for more than 2,000 years and become such a well-known historical tale? To answer that, we need to look at its cultural meaning. In Chinese history, successful people are often recorded, but even those who failed can still be remembered if they are given a certain kind of spiritual value. In this story, Jing Kei represents a spirit of resistance against overwhelming power. In the face of an absolute gap in strength, the weaker side does not have to submit without a voice. Even if the ending is known to be destruction, a person can still speak out and still make one final act of resistance. This kind of tragic, heroic image easily moves people, especially in later generations, when the country faced invasion from outside enemies, or when society faced injustice, people often thought of Jing Shi. He became a kind of spiritual symbol, representing courage, loyalty, and sacrifice. If you have ever seen the film Hero, directed by Zhang Yimou in 2002, the storyline played by Jet Li in that film is based on the story of Jing Shi assassinating the king of Qin. Although from the point of view of historical reason, assassination could not solve the deeper problem, and unification was the larger trend of history, that does not stop people from emotionally sympathizing with Jing Shi. From the Terracotta Army to Jing Shi's attempt to kill the king of Qin, we can see the two sides of Qin history. The Terracotta Army represents order, power, unity, and the supreme authority of the emperor. It is the embodiment of the will of the state and the peak of collectivism. Every terracotta figure is one part of this vast machine. They stand in neat order, silent and obedient. Jing Shi, on the other hand, represents the individual, resistance, loyalty, and tragic emotion. He was like a small stone thrown against this huge machine. He could not stop it from moving forward, but the spark created by his impact lit up the night sky of history. Together, these two things shape the way we understand that era.
Without the Terracotta Army, we could not imagine the organizational power and technical skill of the Qin dynasty. Without the story of Jing Shi assassinating the king of Qin, we could not understand the spiritual world and emotional ideals of the people of that time. In the Terracotta Army Museum, visitors are often shocked by the scale of the clay figures and filled with admiration for the wisdom of ancient laborers. But when people tell the story of Jing Shi, they often sigh over his fate and respect his courage. These two emotions do not contradict each other. They are both natural human responses when facing history. Although the Qin dynasty was short-lived, the legacy it left behind was profound. The Terracotta Army, as a material legacy, has survived to this day, allowing us to see that age directly. The story of Jing Shi, as a spiritual legacy, has been passed down through books, drama, and oral tradition, influencing the values of Chinese people. When we talk about the Qin dynasty, we should not look only at the achievements of Qin Shi Huang. We should also see the fate of small figures like Jing Shi. History is written together by the decisions of great figures and the actions of ordinary ones. There are still many unsolved mysteries surrounding the Terracotta Army that are waiting to be explored. For example, what exactly does the underground palace inside the mausoleum of Qin Shi Huang look like? According to historical records, there are rivers and seas of mercury inside, and modern surveys have indeed found unusually high levels of mercury in the soil. But in order to protect the relics, no active excavation has been carried out so far. This reflects a change in modern archaeological ethics. In the past, people may have been more inclined to dig things up and see them directly. Now, people are more inclined to protect them and allow the relics to remain better preserved underground. This is a form of respect for history. We do not need to dig out everything in order to prove something. Letting these things remain quietly where they are is itself a kind of power. There are also different interpretations of Jing Shi. Some people think he was reckless, while others think he was a hero. This very disagreement also shows the complexity of historical figures. Another mystery also remains unsolved, and that is the weapon used by both sides during Jing Shi's attempt to assassinate the king of Qin. And once we start talking about that dagger, we have to mention one key detail in the assassination itself, which is the problem of the king of Qin drawing his sword. According to the records of the Grand Historian, when Jing Shi raised the dagger and stabbed at the king of Qin, the king was thrown into panic and tried to draw his sword to strike back, but the sword was stuck in its sheath and could not be pulled out. The king of Qin ran around the pillars of the palace while Jing Shi chased after him, and the whole scene became extremely chaotic. Someone shouted that the king should push the sword behind his back before drawing it. The king of Qin followed that advice and finally pulled out the long sword, then cut off Jing Shi's left leg. This detail led to endless later speculation and discussion. Why could the king of Qin not draw his sword? Was there a problem with the scabbard, or was the king simply too nervous? Some people even guessed whether someone had tampered with the king's sword on purpose to make it hard to draw. But there is no evidence for that idea, and it sounds more like later imagination than history. It was not until archaeologists discovered Qin military swords in the pits of the Terracotta Army that this mystery gained new clues.
In 1974, when the Terracotta Army began to be excavated, several bronze swords were later found in Pit 2. Although these swords had been buried for more than 2,000 years, their blades were still bright and sharp when they were unearthed, which shows that the bronze casting technology of the Qin dynasty had reached a very high level. Archaeological measurements show that Qin swords were very long. Some were even longer than 90 centimeters, and the longest were about 95 centimeters. In close combat at that time, the length of a sword meant an advantage in attack range, but it also made carrying and drawing the weapon more difficult. One possible reason the king of Qin had trouble drawing his sword may have been the Qin way of wearing it. Based on the sword-bearing figures found among the terracotta warriors, Qin swords were worn slanting at the waist. The scabbards were long, and the blades were also long, so in an emergency they really would not have been easy to draw quickly. And when a person is in a state of panic, their movements become distorted, which only makes drawing the sword even harder. The rust resistance of Qin swords is also an unsolved mystery. After the Terracotta Army excavation began in 1974, archaeologists discovered a large number of bronze weapons in the pits, including dozens of bronze swords. These swords had lain underground in the yellow earth for more than 2,000 years, yet when they were unearthed, they were still bright and sharp. Even more astonishing, when they were analyzed with modern scientific methods, researchers found that the surface of these bronze swords seemed to have a thin oxidized layer about 10 microns thick, containing about 2% chromium. This discovery immediately shocked the world. That was because chromium salt oxidation treatment was considered an advanced technology only mastered in modern times. More specifically, Germany did not successfully develop this technique until 1937, and the United States only mastered it and applied for a patent in 1950. This would seem to mean that if Qin craftsmen had already mastered such a method more than 2,000 years ago, it would have been extraordinary.
Chromium is a metal that resists high heat, with a melting point of 1,857 degrees Celsius, while bronze smelting can only reach around 900 degrees. This leads to one central question. How could Qin craftsmen possibly have fully integrated chromium into the body of a bronze sword? So why were Qin swords able to remain sharp for 2,000 years? Research from Cambridge University has offered a newer explanation. The true reason why the weapons in the terracotta pits were so well preserved was the combination of the alloy composition of the weapons themselves and the environment of the tomb. Qin swords were made from copper-tin alloy, and they also contained tiny amounts of nickel, aluminum, iron, zinc, and more than 10 other metallic elements. This alloy reached a certain level of hardness. Its inner structure was dense, the surface of the blade was bright and smooth, and the grinding marks on the edge were very fine. Bronze with a relatively high tin content already has strong corrosion resistance, and that is a natural property of the material itself. On top of that, environmental factors such as the soil's acidity, humidity, and oxygen content also played a key role. The terracotta pits had once experienced fire and collapse in history, and the soil inside the pits formed a relatively sealed environment, reducing the entry of oxygen and moisture, and thereby slowing down the oxidation of the bronze. This naturally formed protective environment was even more effective than any artificial coating.
Speaking of historical artifacts and sharp ancient weapons, there is another story we definitely have to mention, King Gujian of Yuyi. Compared with the story of Jing trying to assassinate the king of Qin, one is the sword of a hegemon from the late spring and autumn period, and the other is the dagger of an assassin from the late Warring States period. In 1965, archaeologists discovered a bronze sword in the Wangshan Shu tomb in Jiling, Hubei. When the sword was pulled out from its lacquered wooden scabbard, everyone present was stunned. The blade showed almost no rust at all. It looked bright and fresh, with a dark gray diamond pattern on the surface, and the guard of the sword was inlaid with blue glaze and turquoise. The archaeologists tested it, and with only a light touch, the blade could cut through more than 10 sheets of paper stacked together. On the blade were 8 characters. The king of Yu Gen, made this sword for his own use. The name written there used Juqian, which is an ancient variant form of Gujian. This was the legendary sword of King Gujian of Yuyi. The spine of the sword had a high copper content, which made it relatively flexible and less likely to break. The edge had a high tin content, which gave it greater hardness and allowed it to be sharpened extremely well. The dark diamond pattern on the sword's surface was created through a special treatment, possibly a kind of sulfur-based process or chromium salt oxidation. What is especially interesting is that this kind of surface treatment technology was already mature in the spring and autumn period, but later seems to have been lost during the Qin and Han periods. It was only in modern times, after scientists used electron microscopes to analyze it, that some of the secrets of its composition were finally understood. This sword lay underground for more than 2,400 years, yet when it was unearthed, it showed almost no rust and remained as sharp as ever. If we place these two weapons side by side, the sharpness of the sword of King Gujan of Yui is a lasting sharpness. It was a king's sword. It was not made simply for killing, but also as a symbol of power and status. The sharpness of Jing-Kei's dagger was instant and deadly.
It was an assassin's dagger, and it had only one purpose: to kill. It did not need to be beautiful. It did not need inscriptions. It did not need to survive for thousands of years. It only needed to be short enough, fast enough, and poisonous enough to cut the skin of the King of Qin before he could draw his sword, so that he would die on the spot. The sword of King Gujan of Yu was like a top-level handcrafted warrior blade, something that could both display the beauty of craftsmanship and be used in real combat. Jing-Kei's dagger was more like a tactical knife coated with poison. Its entire value lay in this. It only needed to work once, and once it was used, that was enough. The cultural influence of the Qin dynasty was profound. Standardizing the written script, standardizing wheel tracks, and standardizing weights and measures. These policies were established in the Qin dynasty and influenced China for more than 2,000 years. The Terracotta Army and the story of Jing-Kei trying to assassinate the King of Qin were both products of that larger background. The Terracotta Army reflects the standards of unification. The format of every warrior figure is unified. Jing-Kei's assassination attempt reflects the resistance that arose during the process of unification. The people of the Six States did not want to be absorbed by Qin, and they tried to resist in different ways. Assassination was one extreme method. Although it failed, it reflected the resistance people felt in their hearts at the time. After the fall of the Qin dynasty, that resistance turned into criticism of Qin tyranny. After the Han dynasty was established, it learned from the lessons of Qin and adopted policies of rest and recovery. But the institutional framework built by Qin was largely inherited by the Han. This is what is meant by the phrase, "the Han inherited the system of Qin." For foreign visitors, if you come to China, Xi'an is one stop you should not miss. After seeing the Terracotta Army, if you also hear the story of Jing-Kei, you will gain a more complete feeling for Chinese history. You will see the brilliance of material culture, and you will also see the stirring force of the human spirit. You will understand that Chinese history is not only about the rise and fall of dynasties, but also about the passing down of culture. From the Qin dynasty until today, Chinese people have always valued history, valued records, and valued drawing lessons from the past. The Terracotta Army is a material record. The story of Jing-Kei is a written record. The two complement each other, allowing us to restore the face of that age. Today, when we talk about the Terracotta Army, we are talking about art and archaeology. When we talk about Jing-Kei, we are talking about literature and ethics. Both have already gone beyond the historical events themselves and become cultural symbols. I hope that through today's story, everyone can gain a deeper understanding of the Terracotta Army and Jing-Kei's attempt to assassinate the King of Qin. These are not simply two isolated pieces of historical knowledge. They are two paths leading into ancient Chinese civilization. One leads to the peak of material civilization, and the other leads into the depths of the spiritual world. The Terracotta Army represents the order of power, and Jing-Kei represents the resistance of the individual. Both are real parts of history. The inclusiveness of Chinese culture lies in the fact that it can hold both grand narratives and individual songs of sorrow. Over the long river of history, these two have become intertwined, forming the rich and colorful civilization of China. For foreign friends, this may be a new angle. Western history often emphasizes individual heroism, while Chinese history, even while emphasizing the collective, has never erased the light of the individual. Jing-Kei is one example. In an age that stressed obedience, he made the most disobedient choice possible. That tension is exactly where the charm of history lies. Alright, that is all for today on the Terracotta Army and Jing-Kei's attempt to assassinate the King of Qin. These two topics, one about clay and eternity, and the other about blood and the instant, together sketch out the face of the Qin dynasty. I hope that when you hear these stories, you can feel the weight of history, and also the warmth of human nature. In the next episode, we will continue exploring other wonderful chapters of Chinese history. Thank you for listening, and I will see you next time. Alright, that is everything for today.
Thank you for listening to Chinese history and mythology. If you enjoy my show, please follow, like, and share it with the people around you. You are also very welcome to leave a comment on my blog and share topics you are interested in at bonniespodcasthandbook.blogspot.com. I am really looking forward to hearing from you. Alright, that is all for today's Chinese history and mythology. See you next episode.
Sky in light, Nua healed the broken heart. Fuxi traced the world's design. Every age leaves stories bright. Yaya dynasty shaped bronze. Shang dynasty cast Qin dynasty forged the great walls. Han dynasty opened Silk Road winds. Three kingdoms dynasty turned war to tales. Jing dynasty led Incan mountains bloom. Sui dynasty carved the Grand Canal. Song dynasty raised learning's flame. Yuan dynasty swept the northern plains. Ming dynasty strengthened walls again. Qing dynasty closed an ancient end. Every age leaves stories bright. History and myth ignite in endless light. China's history moves in mystery through the night. Footsteps of this land enchant the world in light. Three kingdoms dynasty turned war to tales. Qin dynasty led Incan mountains bloom. Sui dynasty carved the Grand Canal. Tang dynasty crowned the world with art. Song dynasty raised learn.